We're really excited to have you all joining us for this conversation today on the invisible majority. Nearly 60% of nonprofits in the US run on less than $50,000 a year, and yet they receive less than half of all foundation funding. And so today we're talking about why this gap exists, what it costs the sector, and what small nonprofits can actually do about it. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to tell us in the comments what your organization is, your cause area, and how many people are working for your nonprofit so that we can get an idea of the different sizes that we've got today in the room with us. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. We've got Grace Sato, who's Director of Research at Candid. Last year, Grace dove into and pardon me a moment, I'm having double audio. So Grace Sato dove into the sector to learn more about small nonprofits, and she's got the insights that we need for this conversation. Aleda Gagarin is Vice President of Influence at Candid. She defines how Candid shows up and has an impact on the nonprofit sector, and she knows what small nonprofits are up against right now. And if you're a frequent flyer at our Candid Learning webinars, you probably already know Educational Programming Manager Ivonne Simms. She trains nonprofit folks from across the country, and in particular focuses on how under-resourced organizations can get the funding they need. All right, let's kick things off with looking in at the data. So Grace, when we look at very small nonprofits, what do we see?
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. When we did research on these very small nonprofits, what we meant by that are organizations that are eligible to and filed the 990N postcard, which is what the IRS created for organizations with gross receipts of $50,000 or less. And so what we found was, like you mentioned, they represent the majority of 501c3 public charities in the US, and they're just likely to be doing hyper-local grassroots work, kind of think your local parks and rec or youth sports leagues or parent-teacher associations, things like that. There's a lot that we don't know about them, but what we do know is that they are involved in kind of every variety of issue-facing communities. So it could be in the arts or in health or religion. But the major two categories are in human services and education. We also know that they tend to be younger, so the majority received their tax-exempt status in 2010 or later. And when we compare the data with Candid's demographics data, we can also see that they tend to have more diverse leadership. So their CEOs tend to be more racially diverse, and their boards have more racial and gender diversity. So those are the things that we kind of unpacked when we did the research.
So we know that very small nonprofits don't have to share as much data, which can mean that we don't know as much about them from their Forms 990. Can you share a lot about the gaps that we have with knowledge around them?
Yeah, it's the 990 end is called a postcard for a reason. It's because it's really short. And this is a good thing for small nonprofits. It really reduces the administrative burden of their annual filing. But like you said, there are a lot of gaps to what we can know about them. And so it's really basic information that we don't have comprehensively, like their mission statements or who they serve. We know nothing about their finances other than that 50,000 threshold that they meet. So we don't know, how much they're getting in revenue or how much of their expenses is for programs. So yeah, there are just a lot of gaps in our knowledge of them unless they choose to disclose more information. We know that some 990N organizations actually voluntarily fill out like the longer 990 forms just for transparency, but that doesn't happen a lot. And part of why we did the research was they represent such a large part of the sector, And yet research about the nonprofit sector often excludes them. You'll just see in the methods or the limitations that, like the small nonprofits weren't counted for the research. And that's why we called them the invisible majority. They're such an important part of the sector, and they just don't get counted because of how little we know about them.
Yeah, and so, Ivonne, I think this is a great question for you. Why aren't they putting more information out there?
I think these are the nonprofits that are out there doing the work. A lot of the times when I teach at the library, for instance, I'm meeting those leaders who are taking a couple of hours out of their day after doing the actual nonprofit work. Like, they're not just leading, they're out there doing the programming, they're, raising the money, they're out there in the community. So they don't really have time. I run into so many people who are just trying to actually get impact done, and they're not thinking about, oh, I have to fill out these forms and I need to, report these things. They're more concerned with people aren't eating. These kids don't have somewhere to go after school. So they're just not thinking about, they don't have the time to think more broadly. And when they get a little bit more, when they learn a little bit more and they get maybe more volunteers, more staff, they're able to do those kinds of things. But just generally, they want to get the work done. They want to help the community.
So we know that like nonprofits that are of this size are having struggles. Do we know anything from the data about what in particular they're struggling with, or what is the most challenging for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear from people who are here, if you represent a small nonprofit, what your challenges are. The thing that was clear in the data is the challenges around funding, specifically foundation funding, because we have data for that. So they are far less likely to receive foundation grants. They represent 60% of the sector, and they're receiving like 0.4% of foundation funding. So they're just not on the radar of foundations. And last year, we were doing research with AppFee specifically about small Black-led nonprofits, and we did a number of interviews with them. And what we heard from them was it's not just a matter of capacity of like having bandwidth to look for and apply for grants or knowing how to apply for grants. That could be part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And what they told us was that they're just like excluded from foundation grants from the get-go because foundations might have restrictions on you have to be a certain number of years old, or you need to have certain finances in place. And so they're just not even allowed to apply. So there are other barriers than just being knowing how to get a foundation grant. And the last point I'll make on this is that we also found that small nonprofits, one, it's harder for them to get grants, but when they do get a grant, it's often more likely to be a one-off. So when you think about these larger nonprofits and the relationships with funders, it's not unexpected that you get a grant once and then you'll get supported again the next year or the year after that. But for these small organizations, it's like they're lucky to get a grant, and that might be the only thing they get from the foundation. So there were some clear like disadvantages for small organizations when it came to foundation funding.
So I think it'd be easy to look at this data and just say like, well, they need to get better at grant writing. They need to build better relationships. We know that is the wrong conclusion. Aleda, do you want to share kind of why that's the wrong way?
Yeah, I mean, that line of thinking, ironically, and this happens a lot in philanthropy, I think tracks with broader systemic issues of exclusion, right? And some of our own research with AppFee shows that. So I want to say that, first of all, the onus is not just on nonprofits. Many of these small nonprofits do incredible work with very limited resources that is really important to their communities. And I'm a big fan of reminding folks that not everything good is scalable, and nor should it be. In reality, I think that funders should be doing a lot more in terms of being open to taking a chance on small nonprofits with big impact in their communities. And donors have a responsibility, not just, I want to encourage donors, and also you have a responsibility to expand your horizons of who you're working with and who you're investing in. A lot of funders talk about equity, but one of the biggest reasons there's not equity in the social sector is because of social capital issues. That's not a skills issue. To the earlier point from Grace, it's about who's not being invited and getting a seat at the table. So I would ask funders, pull up some new chairs, invite some more of your neighbors, and invest in small organizations with big impact continually, because they deliver so much good.
And you know what? I would just add to that. I know a lot of small nonprofit leaders who are kind of upset about the table. They're kind of like, you know what? We need to figure out different ways to do things, because we've not been invited. It's clear that this has not been built for us. And so maybe we just need to find other ways. And they're trying to create systems outside of the current systems. And, you can't even be mad at them when you're like, come to a grant writing class, because they're kind of like, they don't really want to fund me. And guess what? All this time that I'm taking to learn this and then do it gets me, $5,000, and I could have done that differently. So it's kind of a struggle sometimes when I'm telling people, oh, you should XYZ, or this will help you. They're kind of like, yeah, I tried that and I've not seen it really work. So it's a push and pull sometimes.
Yeah, Ivonne, and I think it's one of the bummers about the sector sometimes, and philanthropy in general, is the extent to which we sort of repeat the same structures and systems that caused the inequities and the issues that we're working to solve in the first place. So I think, I'm a really annoying nerd about power structures. As someone that studied and worked in community advocacy. And I do think the more power you have, the more responsibility you have. So if you're a funder sitting on many millions of dollars, or even in the billions, the onus is on you to find small organizations, not small strapped organizations who are doing a great job in their communities, to figure out how to work up your ladder and get to you.
Exactly.
To that point, we did do the research on that, of how these inequities get repeated in the philanthropy system. And so when we were doing interviews with these Black-led organizations, they were describing pretty systemic problems, like double standards that their nonprofits are held to versus the other organization doing very similar work in their communities, and they're even more in debt and yet getting funded for similar work, or not just being excluded from funder networks, but if they do get funding, then being kind of used as props for marketing, or having their expertise just be kind of used for other trainings and not being compensated for it. So we did publish some research on it earlier this year about how that feels for Black-led nonprofits trying to build those relationships with philanthropy as it currently exists.
So, Aleda, you talked a little bit about this, of that funders seem to have the power in the relationship, and funders do need to step up more and change things. What can nonprofits do to change that relationship?
Yeah, I think first of all, recognize the power that you have. I remind nonprofits all the time, and used to do this all the time in-person proposal writing bootcamp trainings. Foundations can't exist without you. They cannot have their tax exempt status without your work, right? The work of nonprofits on the ground are required for foundations to exist. So I would say treat funders and individual donors. It's a bit different, but treat them like your partners, especially folks that are local in your community. Bring them in, ask them for advice. There's the old adage of you ask for advice, you get money, you ask for money, you get advice, but really treat folks like partners and get them embedded in your work so that they love it and they feel called to it and committed to it. And in addition to bringing them in, I think you have to figure out what works for you and your organization, but sometimes it is worth calling funders in. So if you know there's a funder in your community that funds work that's very similar to yours, but maybe the organization has been running longer or they have a different makeup of leadership, and you feel like you are being excluded from having a seat at the table at some point, maybe you can have a good enough conversation with a funder to not just bring them in, but to call them in on their practices, to really ask questions about why do we continue to not be funded? It might be an entirely different reason than you think, but you don't know unless you ask. And if it's about something that you're missing, then that's a benefit because you can work to then figure that out. But if they're just missing the fact that they're not including groups like yours at the table, you're giving them the opportunity and the benefit of changing behaviors as well.
Yeah, agree. I think asking questions is so important because, listen, if I'm just meeting you, you're my new funder, we're going to start this relationship, I have every right. I don't know anything. I don't know any better, right? I can ask you all of the questions. I can say all of the things maybe I'm not supposed to say because I don't know. And this helps funders see what they should be doing. If you're my second funder and I have a good relationship with other funders or even donors, I can talk about what that looks like and how I'd love to continue that kind of work with you. I just think it's up to, like Aleda said, the foundations can't exist without the nonprofits. The nonprofits are doing the work. They're the experts. They're on the ground. Treat it as such. Use that expertise. Teach your foundations and your funders, and just feel confident about the fact that you are doing the work, you're making the impact, and if we work together, we can do even more. Use that and make sure that you're owning that. I say it to nonprofits all the time as well. And I think once they do feel very confident and they're owning the work that they do and they realize how much power they have, that kind of changes the dynamic. It doesn't work with every funder, but it has worked. And I've seen people really have good relationships around understanding their own power.
So, Aleda, as VP of Influence, what do you see as Candid's role in helping small nonprofits?
We love small nonprofits. We absolutely love them. And we've really focused on how can we, create more equity for smaller nonprofits through what we have to offer, which is our data. That's what Candid has to offer in our tools. So what I would recommend to small nonprofits, if you haven't claimed your nonprofit profile on Candid, just go to candid.org. Please do it. It's really important. Funders will trust you more when you're more and more transparent about your resources, your model for work, your finances. So that's incredibly helpful. Candid did research last year that showed that nonprofits with a seal of transparency, and big reminder, Candid does not rank or qualify nonprofits. We do not say if you are good or you are bad. We only focus on how transparent you are being, which I think is a really important differentiation with us. So nonprofits with a seal of transparency on their Candid profile, on average, are getting 62% more contributions than nonprofits without it. So go and claim your seal, and then you'll get benefits from that. So you will have a shareable link to your profile that you can send to as many donors and funders as you want to tell your full story and show your transparency. And those on the receiving end will not hit any kind of registration wall or paywall. We want to make sure that you are owning and benefiting from the data that you decide to share. It also makes you more visible to places that you can't get into otherwise, particularly community foundations and donor advised funds, where you really can't reach out directly to the funders in your community. But oftentimes they are leveraging Candid's data to source local nonprofits that they want to give to. We have over 200 massive organizations that leverage our data in that way. So then you become discoverable. And the last thing I'll say is that we have a program called Go for Gold. It's evergreen. We want to make sure that nonprofits are really benefiting in mutual relationship with Candid from contributing their data. So if you have less than $1 million in expenses and you claim your profile and get up to a gold seal of transparency, then you can get access to our fundraising tools for free. And you can keep doing that every year that you're a small nonprofit. And lastly, I'll just double down on invite them in, bring them to your local events, show them what you're doing.
So we've got some amazing conversation happening in the chat right now. We know there's a range of nonprofit sizes. A lot are dealing with kind of the issues that we're talking here. You know, they're at capacity, they have limited time, they're, you know, trying to get funding and it's just not going well. Ivonne, what can they do to set themselves up for success right now?
One thing I really like is exposure and connection and community. It feels like it might be a little slow, but for me, having hosted different webinars at Candid, I started going from consultants, from having like, you know, the expert consultant speak to having the nonprofit leader speak. And the nonprofit leader who has a really small grassroots organization because they have expertise and they know what they're doing. And what I love to hear is all these people are now wanting to, you know, connect with me on LinkedIn. I had a lunch with a couple of other nonprofits. Oh, we were talking to a funder because they saw us on my show, no, on the webinar. So it's really nice, I think, when you're out there, and it's kind of an oxymoron because how am I doing all this work and I'm at every conference and I'm at, you know, every meeting and gathering, but you know, pick and choose. But what I've seen is that nonprofit leaders who are kind of just out there talking about what they're doing and they're finding spaces to show what they do, they meet people and they network and they end up having a lot of exposure, and that exposure is really helpful. So that's one thing I would say. And then just a trick or a tip rather, from one of my leaders who's in Kentucky. She joined the Chamber of Commerce in her city. And I think she was invited by someone else. There was a discounted membership. And she's just like, oh my goodness, I'm one of the only nonprofits in the room. And so when all these small businesses hear what I'm doing and what I need, I get a lot of help. You know, ties for all the young men, dinner coupons, you know, whatever it is. But the local businesses want to support, and they get excited about the fact that they can support one of their own. So, you know, I don't know if you can all join your Chamber of Commerce, not sure what the costs are, but I know that there's a lot of ROI according to a few leaders that I've spoken to.
That's fantastic. So I got one question left for the group here. So this is the perfect time to prepare your questions. If you have questions for Ivonne, Aleda, Grace, we are happy to answer them now. So throw them in the chat. While folks are gathering their questions, are there any last tips, tricks, favorite ways, you know, to get small nonprofits more visible, help them get their names out there, help them get a leg up?
I would say leverage the networks and the tables that you do have already, whether it's small foundations, community foundations, or individuals. The people you know other people. So it might be hard in terms of social capital with the larger grants. And like I said before, that's something that foundations really need to do some inner work on. But even if you have like your 5 top individual donors and they all live in your city or your county, talk to them and see if they're willing to host like a meet and greet with their friends and family or their community or volunteer members. So leverage your own networks. Yvonne's suggestion of businesses is, I think, fantastic. And same thing with foundations. I do that at Candid all the time, and we're not a small nonprofit, but I think it applies to everyone. So if you have any kind of institutional funder, even if they just give you $3,000 a year, they might know peers that are similar in the area that might also give you $3,000 a year. So, you know, leverage the networks that you do have at your disposal currently.
Yeah, Aleda brings up a good point. We hear all the time funders pick up the phone for other funders. So if you have a funder already and you're thinking about some other, you know, you see alignment with other foundations, ask them, do they know someone? I literally was sitting at a foundation with a program officer. We were having lunch with just a few of their grantees, and she invited another program officer from a different foundation to hang out with us. And so we were, you know, talking candid stuff and talking to each other. And she was just asking like, oh, wait, we fund this kind of work. We learned a lot about how different funders can be. We know that that's a thing as well. But just the fact that it was a nice open conversation, they were talking about who they knew, and oh, I can send you their number, or send me something I can send to them. It was just a really nice. That's a very I don't know every funder is like this, but it was nice to know that they know each other, and if they like your work, now you can talk to them about it and ask, can you introduce me?
Great. So one of the questions and conversations that's kind of happening right now is about what Aleda shared around Candid seals, and that there's now the research team has shown that 62% increase in contributions on average after that. Grace, can you share a little bit more about that and what we know about small nonprofits from that research?
Yeah, let me jog my memory on that study. But yes, it was a study that we replicated from a research design that had been created by academic researchers that was published in a journal. And so because we wanted to kind of get an update on, is the seal still kind of worth it for nonprofits, we replicated that study. And what it did find was that when we controlled for various factors, that could also be contributing to contributions like size or where you're located, we controlled for a variety of things and found that it still is worth it to get a seal. And that holds true for small nonprofits as well. It might be a little, we called it a white paper because we know that there are benefits for Candid to promoting our seals, but you can read the literature. We show our full methods, what we controlled for, and the conclusion still seemed to be that it does boost contributions to have a seal.
Great. We've got a question mainly for Ivonne. So you talked about nonprofits having power over foundations. Aleda, you talked about a very similar thing. And they're wondering, what does that actually look like for one nonprofit, not an aggregate?
I think it has to almost be, you have to be really bold. I mean, I know Aleda and I are similar in the sense that we like to just say what we're going to say. And I realize that's not always easy, but when you start a relationship with a foundation, that's the best time to just be bold and clear and direct and establish that pattern so that people understand what kind of leader you are, what kind of work you do, and that you understand your power. Maybe power isn't the word. You understand your impact. You understand the work you're doing. You are the expert. And so, yes, that isn't necessarily power. I can't make a foundation do anything, but I can make you understand my presence and the kind of work that I do. And that follows you. I know leaders that are very much like, I'm not doing XYZ anymore. I'm just not. And so I'm going to lose some money because all money isn't good money, but I'm also going to gain a reputation. I'm on panels. People are looking at me. And now other foundations are saying, this is my type of leader and we align. And this is who I'm going to give to. So it's not going to be like this straight road where, yes, I'm exerting my power and every foundation's giving me money. I think it's probably working a little bit parallel to the system. And the system is starting to go in that direction, at least for the funders that you want.
Yeah, I would also, first of all, fantastic question. So thank you. And very fair question. And
yes,
I can't pretend that a nonprofit, especially a small one on its own, has the same kind of power that nonprofits in aggregate do, like I was speaking to before. So I want to be clear that I'm also not saying, like, when I say nonprofits have power, I'm not saying that every nonprofit has equivalent power to every foundation. I wish they did, but we know that that's not how the world works. So to Yvonne's point, like really focusing on what your impact is as your power in your community and for your causes. Even smaller nonprofits that find alternative means, like that's a form of power by saying, you know what, I'm building a different table with my peers. That is its own form of power building. I would also say advocating for yourself and increasing the power that you have, even if it's not equivalent to a big foundation or a funder, is still building power. Making sure that those that you're either serving or working with are doing that with you, so that even if you're one nonprofit, it's not about the power of, the one person running the nonprofit in a meeting that they have, that it's a collective power between the nonprofit and your community, bringing up stories. Yeah, it's still there. It's tough, but it's still there, and you can leverage it.
So we've had a few questions that are kind of on a similar theme, which is, how do we get the board involved? How do we get them to be active? How do we get them to help our small nonprofit? What is their role in all of this?
We teach a board class, and a lot of times, unfortunately, the answer, depending on who these board members are, is to start over or to start getting some board members out. And I know that sounds terrible, but just because if you haven't established, if you don't care about what we do and you don't know that it's your role to help us in the money parts of things, then something went wrong. And if I can change it, if I can, say, hey, we maybe didn't start off this way, but now we understand what your value is in terms of our fundraising, and people are open to it, great. But sometimes there are board members who are just like, oh, I didn't know that was part of it. I don't want to be a part of this. You asked me for a favor, that kind of thing. So board members who understand that they are a part of what you do, and they are passionate and they love what you do, that's what you want. Because now I can kind of say anything like, hey, we need you to talk to this person, or hey, can you get on social media and talk about what we do? Do you have any ideas? Do you know anyone? Do you have any ideas? All of those things should be something a board member should be happy to do. And if that's not the case, then you may have to start changing that culture. And it may be a part of it, partly, getting rid of some people and replacing them. But yes, board members should know that they love what you do and they can't wait to get in and do what they can.
Yeah, and I think you also have to be both strategic and tactical with how you leverage your board's expertise. Boards of nonprofits are all volunteers that likely have other jobs, roles, or responsibilities in their lives. So it's not enough to go to a board, no matter how big your nonprofit is. I think this is pretty universal. You can't just look at your board and say, well, we need help fundraising, and then turn around. That's not specific enough, right? So one thing that I do with Candid's board of trustees, who are fantastic, is instead of saying we need help with fundraising, I'll send them essentially a questionnaire with, here are these top prospects that we're looking at in this quarter. Do you know these people or someone else at this organization? And it's like a form that they can easily fill out. Here are the top 3 things we're fundraising for. Am I missing anybody? So really targeted, explicit questions, with the follow-up being, will you make a connect? Will you, vouch for Candid and make a connection on our behalf? And I'll often meet with them then individually for 25 minutes just to run through it and agree upon next steps, right? So it's really about setting them up for success as well, and not just putting the responsibility on them. Even with social media, when we have a big announcement that we'd love our board to promote online, I don't just ping them and say, hey, can you post about this? Kate right here drafts 3 different options of text that they can leverage and edit to however they please, but giving them instructions and a starting point of resources to work from to make their jobs easier to finish.
Great. So there's been a lot of interest in the research and what we're doing, and there's some curiosity if we're going to be doing more research into small nonprofits and kind of where things stand with them.
We are brainstorming some next steps. I can't promise that we'll do an exact replica of this annually moving forward, but we are starting to talk about what other questions people might have and other slices of the data that might be interesting. The other thing that might be interesting for folks is we are currently working on some research to unpack alignment between nonprofits and funders in what they look for. So what are foundations saying that they look for in funding decisions? What are nonprofits trying to promote about themselves? And we're in the stage of doing the analysis just to understand like how much are nonprofits and funders actually thinking the same thing, how much misalignment is there. So that research is forthcoming and hopefully will be released by the end of the year.
Great. Well, we are going to wrap up now. I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers. This was fantastic conversation. You know, small nonprofits don't get a lot of attention. And so just to even have this time to talk through this is fantastic. Thank you to everyone who's watching. The conversation has been amazing, and I can't wait to go back through. We did share some resources in the chat, in the comments. So if you are a small nonprofit and want to check out that Go for Gold program, the link is in there. So is our key fact sheet about very small nonprofits. And I hope that you'll join us next month. Our interim president and CEO, John Brothers, is going to be chatting with us on July 15th at 12 p.m. So you can ask all your questions about what his role is, you know, being an interim president and CEO, amongst other things, you know, where's Candid going? What's going on in the sector? So he'll be ready to tackle all of your questions. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.